of Utopos, or literally a no place. But the Greeks always, when they wanted to talk about an imagined place, they always also wanted to talk about it as an EU topos, a good place, so that even in the abstract, they always wanted to be talking about an imagined place, but also a good place, a place where humanity has been expanded, if you will. And I think that gives us some access into not only what these people were about, but also what Garland was trying to do in the beach. This is a picture of the Mansion House, which was the 100,000 square foot building that the Oneida community members built over a series of 4 stages from 1862 through 1878. And this person here is John Humphrey Noyes, the founder of this religious community. And this is a picture dating from the community times of the south wing, the so-called children's wing of the Mansion House, looking from the south gardens and the kind of Eden that they wanted to create. Now, who were these people, and what were they about? The Oneida community was a group of. This was a religious group. They called themselves 2 things. They called themselves perfectionists and Bible communists. So these people, who at their height of this community had roughly 300 members, which you can see here surrounding them on some of the lawns of the garden, and right at the center of this, of course, is John Humphrey Noyes. But this was, as I say, a religious community that was just one of several dozen communities that were established and grew up in the middle to latter part of the 19th century in America. But even though this was one of several such communes that were started, it was one of the longest lived. It was certainly one of the most successful communities of those that were started. And I think there's 2 points that I'd like to make regarding this community that make it particularly interesting. The first is that even though this was a religious community founded, as we will see, upon a particular understanding of the Bible, they recognized that they couldn't succeed unless they were successful economically. In other words, they couldn't realize their own internal needs and goals, and they certainly couldn't project themselves out into the larger society. So these people became very successful manufacturers. The most important things that they manufactured were animal traps, but also here's just an advertisement for dyed silk thread. And they also they preserved their own fruit and vegetable produce. So they recognized that if they were going to succeed, any idea, any community that was serious would have to be based upon what they considered good ideas, and they felt they had them, hard work, and money. The second thing that I think is important, and I can show you some slides of these at the end, was that even though this community, which lasted from 1848 to 1881, broke up in 1881 for a variety of different reasons, it was transformed into a joint stock company. And so all of the members were given shares of stock in this new company called Oneida Community Limited. And after the breakup, this is a picture of the 1920s, they built for themselves this sort of university Gothic building, which was their headquarters of the business that was established and grew out of the original community. And by that time, they had given up everything but continued to produce a very small item that had started during the community, silverware. So they became one of the largest in the world producers of silverware, Oneida silverware. And they also became a leader in what might be called welfare capitalism. In other words, translating some of those Bible communist ideas of the original community into how they should run a for-profit corporation, so that some of the egalitarian outreach of the original community got translated into this new Oneida Community Limited. Well, as I mentioned, these people called themselves two things: Bible communists and perfectionists. What we see here is John Humphrey Noyes as a young man. He had graduated from Dartmouth. He was going to be a lawyer, but he got swept up in a religious revival of the 19th century, of the early to mid-19th century, a religious revival called the Second Great Awakening. And so he was converted into this idea of becoming a religious leader. He went to Yale Divinity School, but he was ejected from Yale Divinity School because of his unusual, highly unorthodox beliefs of his reading of the Bible. And this is where we come into perfectionism. John Humphrey Noyes believed in a highly unorthodox, indeed heretical idea that the second coming of Christ was not a future event, as Orthodox Christianity would have it, was a past event. It took place in 70 AD at the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, so that the second coming being in the past created a situation where the kingdom of God was in the process of unfolding right now. And it was possible for people to become perfect as Christ was perfect by what we will come to call Bible communism. In other words, how can you become selfless? How can you become sinless as Christ was sinless? Well, you can do that by giving up all rights to property. Property is what leads us to sinfulness. So it was not just, however, land and tools and goods of that nature or money that you had to share, but as they read the Bible, they said in the book of Acts that the early church, just after Christ's crucifixion, the early church shared all property in common. So that's where they got idea of how you could become Christ-like, by shedding all ownership of property. But they took it one very, very dramatic step further. They said that not only these traditional kinds of property were selfish-inducing, but also monogamous marriage was a kind of private ownership. And so they said, we, because we're in heaven, and Christ says in the Gospel according to Luke, when Christ is asked, he gives this answer of this sort of riddle, in heaven one is neither given nor taken in marriage. And they said, okay, heaven is here and now, we're in the middle of heaven, so we should have a kind of arrangement in which all adult men are married to all adult women. And free sexual consensual relations should be allowed between these consenting adults. So that we can become selfless, sinless, by giving up all these rights to property. Now, a companion to this idea, to marriage slavery as they saw it in their creation of complex marriage, that they should have only the children that they wanted and that they could afford. Now, one of the interesting things was this community lasted for basically 33 years. There were only 96 children born into that community, into that sexually active community. And they said that we will devise a form of birth control, what they called male continence, and we can talk about that, so that we will only have those children that we can afford, that we can nurture, that we can care for. And so they only had 96. In the first 20 years, from 48 to 68, when they were relatively poor, they had only 40 children, an average of 2 a year. But then because of all the success of their businesses, they had enough money to not only build the mansion house, but to do everything else that they wanted. So between 68 and 79, when they gave up complex marriage, they had 56 planned children. And overall, this community had these 96 children. 2/3 of them, 65% of them, were planned. Now, a couple of other things just about the Bible communist aspect here. And this is them as members, the women you see in pantalettes and an overdress, allowing them the freedom of action that Victorian styles at that particular time was the absolute opposite. They cut their hair short, again, for convenience and ease and freedom. But here are people socializing, these people who are now married one to the other, all to each other in the quadrangle of the mansion house. But a couple of other things about the community, Bible communism. They had a process of dealing with what they saw as inevitable eruptions of selfishness, of what they called special love, a man for a woman, a parent for a child, or even a person to a thing. For example, my grandfather was a concert-level, my great-grandfather was a concert-level violinist, and he would occasionally take too much pride in how good he was or how much pleasure he was taking in playing his violin. And so John Humphrey Noyes would force him, according to the diary I've inherited, to force him to lock it up until he had purged himself from that special love of him for his violin. And so they had what they called a form of mutual criticism of bringing those issues out into the open and of dealing with them as a community to get people focused back again on the community and what that meant in terms of showing to the world that heaven and earth could be merged at one in the same time. The other thing that they were acutely aware of and sensitive to was that John Humphrey Noyes himself was the key leader, and there was a danger inevitably in that kind of situation of having the leader do everything and everybody else just flow in and around, if you will, the base of this person. But he and they, in effect, insisted that they have a central committee made up of both men and women who advised him. And even more importantly, on the ground, they had a group of over 20 committees that dealt with every aspect of daily life, from running their businesses, to raising their children, to educating their children, to taking care of their food needs, their entertainment needs, their cultural needs, to their relations to the outside world. Now, what I'd like to do, and these are just some of the people. One of them, this person right here, is John Humphrey Noyes' sister, who is my great-great-great-grandmother. So I sort of go back to the original tree, if you will, of this particular community. This particular woman was Mother Noyes, John Humphrey Noyes' wife, who he was legally married to, but became part of the complex marriage arrangement. But other people, for example, this person up here was a licensed architect and was the person who helped to draw all the designs for the mansion house as they thought up what they wanted it to look like. But what I wanted to do now is to just talk a little bit about what I see as 5 uh, basic characteristics of daily life. The first one of which was this was a place that really uh, had a serious work ethic. Even though the workday was shorter than average at that time, and even though there was a variety of job rotation arrangements, this was a place that really emphasized work. Everybody worked, men and women and children. And what we see here is that job rotation. These are just some cartoons, if you will, some drawings of one of the members, Milton Newhouse, who shows the men doing kitchen work, waiting on tables, working in the kitchen, or up in here doing the laundry, for example. So it wasn't just women's work to do the cooking and the waiting on people or the laundry. There was job rotation, as reflected also in the fact that women worked in the factories, were supervisors of factories, were also the editors of many of their publications and the print setters, et cetera. So there was intentional job rotation so that 2 things could happen. One, you could take advantage of everybody's talent. And secondly, you gave variety to the workday by giving these kinds of job rotations. And when they needed to meet special demands, they made carpet bags, and here's what they called a BEE, where everybody came together and brought in the crops, or helped to make to fill an order of traps, or here to make these carpet bags. Now, coming back to their businesses, this was the one that was the first order of business and the most successful, the one that brought them the most money. Sewell Newhouse, whose name is here, was a member. He was a blacksmith and a trapper, and he had invented this trap, and he hand forged maybe 1,000 of these a year by just hand forging them. What these people did is to persuade him to show them how to do it, and then because they had a lot of people with a lot of talent, they manufactured their own machines, built their own factories, and started mass producing these. So that by the 1860s to 1870s, they were producing about 450,000 of these a year. They became the largest manufacturer of animal traps in the continental United States. And these are some people working in the factory. These are a whole bunch of the workers, not members of the community, what they called hirelings that were brought in to work, in this case, the animal trap, in what became the largest manufacturing trap building in the United States. They also took advantage of the invention of the sewing machine and the revolution that was having in textiles. So they got silk thread, dyed it, and spun it, and sold that to that burgeoning market of women with sewing machines, as well as businesses. And these are some of the so-called silk girls, other hirelings who lived in the area, were drawn to the area and worked in the factory. Here are some of the silk girls, but here also you see some community members who were supervising this. So they were not just sitting at home or not working as other people were on the farm or in the factory in menial jobs. They were doing serious work. They also preserved fruits and vegetables. This was right down from the mansion house. This giant building was where they put in glass bottles their produce that they were making. In Wallingford, just down the road from here, they had a branch community, and there they started a very early form of silverware, of forks and spoons. And you can see here, they're very crude. They were either iron or steel, but very, very very, very crude. But it was sufficiently successful that they figured by the time of the breakup that it was worth saving, and they transferred that from Wallingford to Niagara Falls in New York. So this was daily life. They worked hard and very successfully. Secondly, the second thing was there was a constant search for improvement. That was a hallmark of perfectionism. And they saw that not only as an individual quest, one person improving him or herself, but society constantly improving. And the key to that was education. And so these people, right from the beginning, emphasized education. One of the fanciest rooms in the Mansion House was the library. And they had here everything, all the magazines, important magazines of the day. But it was also books on religion, of course, but also novels, the novels of Charles Dickens, the poetry of Longfellow and Tennyson, books on biology, books on chemistry, books on ancient Egypt. So that what they were after was a well-educated person who, through lifelong learning, was constantly improving, constantly developing one's own talent. All of the boys and girls were educated by these people up through high school. I came across some findings from the 1870 census, U.S. Census, and they show in 1870, right at this particular time, only 48% of kids between the ages of 5 and 19 went to school at all. 48% going to school at all. An average school year for those people who did go to school was 78 days. And 2% of those people graduated from high school. Now here, in a place of perfectionist aspiration, every boy and girl was educated up through high school. And they sent 13 of their young men off to Yale for further education. They wanted people to be what you call Renaissance men and women, fully developed, if you will, fully knowledgeable about the world around them and of all of what we would call the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. On the ceiling of the big hall, here are just two of the four muses, if you will, that they have. This is the muse of astronomy and the muse of history. So they wanted people to know everything. But they also wanted a rich cultural life. So they built lawns and gardens that would reflect Eden. This is heaven. This is the new Eden. So this is a modern look at the Mansion House from the South Garden, which Kate has a little plot in to help take care of as part of living in the Mansion House. We both of us live in the Mansion House. But they had their own orchestra. They had their own choral groups. They put plays on their stage in the big hall that I'll show you in just a moment. So this was a place emphasizing constant improvement. The third thing was that they said that the good society ought not to be just a liberated society, it ought to be a comfortable one. In other words, a good society is freeing people to realize their full potential, their full talents. But if we do that, they said, we will also be able to create a comfortable environment. And so to them, this meant that they had, and they ought to have, indoor heating. They had central heating here by the 1870s. They had indoor plumbing here by the 1870s. They emphasized a largely vegetarian, but by no means completely vegetarian diet, but a very healthy diet. They had lots of outbuildings to entertain people, their children, to educate and entertain them. etc. And so they wanted this to be a comfortable as well as liberating place. Now, what I'm going to show you here are some interior shots of the mansion house, because this is I'm talking about the fourth point about daily life, and it has to do with what I call the architecture of community. In other words, every society has one or more architectures of what kinds of buildings they produce, and how those buildings connect to nature and to connect to other parts of the built environment. And what they recognized right from the beginning was that architecture has both public spaces that brings people together, that unites them, allows them to govern themselves, allows them to work together, allows them to educate themselves, etc. But they're also private spaces. And so what I'm going to be showing you here are the recognition of that public and private space, and how architecture helps us to build and maintain the community. Because here is the big hall where they had a meeting every night. And everything took place here, bringing the community together to govern themselves, to talk about their business successes and failures, to talk about what's going on in education of their own selves, of what's happening in the larger world. Everything was taking place in this big hall, which is continued to be right now and used in multiple public ways. And this is a picture of the way it looked at the time of the community. But they also said we need more smaller spaces, but spaces where people can congregate. This was the most elaborate of them, the upper sitting room, the most elegant of them, but they had many of these kinds of small salons that would bring people together to socialize. And off of these, as we will see, are individual bedrooms. Every adult man and woman had his or her own individual bedroom, their own private sanctuary, if you will. But as you can see here, you're always being drawn out into public space. They always want you to be part of that larger community. And this is a picture of the children who had their own wing and were cared for by members in their own wing, but they would be brought together for public functions in the upper sitting room. This is a schoolhouse. Look how elaborate that is for the 1870s to educate their own kids. And they had their own teachers from the community, but if necessary, they brought in people from the outside because they were experts. They wanted these kids to be. And this is a playhouse on the south lawn. Again, a place where children can exercise, but also have things for themselves. So this is a comfortable place. This is a nurturing place that they felt they had to have. And this is part of the north lawn. This is the summer house. Again, another congregating place in the hot season, in the summertime, etc. And here's you see the women once again in their garb. But they also recognized that they needed private space. You needed private space for basically three reasons. One, you needed it for your own spiritual life, your own prayer life. That takes place individually. You need to be private in that prayer life, in the development of your own spiritual life. But the sexual life, what they called the social life of the community, you need privacy for that. So the sexual activity would take place in one of the male or female members' private bedrooms. But they also recognized, as we've seen in a variety of sources, that these people recognized you needed privacy just to get out of the juice. You just needed places to get away from everybody else. And this was a pretty intensely come into the center kind of community. And so they did have that kind of privacy. Now, the final thing, emphasizing the daily life, was that they had very open-ended and sophisticated, I think, relations with the outside world. In part, that was because they wanted the outside world to recognize that they were creating heaven on earth here and now. This is what heaven on earth looked like. And so they wanted everybody to know this place exists and this is what it looks like. One way of getting at that was through their publication called the Oneida Circular, the Circular, and the journal. But they also published things on their birth control system, male continence, on mutual criticism, etc., and all they were about. But they also wanted people to come and experience heaven on earth, what the new Eden looked like. And so they would welcome 500, 600 people at a time to come and look at the mansion house, look at this new Eden, look at this heaven on earth. I just came across some figures recently where they documented between 1863 and 1868, 48,000 people came to visit the Oneida community because that's how they felt they could see this as a model and go and do likewise. But they also recognized that they had very unorthodox beliefs and that their neighbors could take real exception to that. So they did a variety of things to make sure that all of their neighbors were good neighbors. They did that because they did that in the following way. In the first place, there were 300 members here, but they had 300 hirelings working in the silk factory, in the trap factory. They paid them above average wages. They built a series of tenement houses so that workers who were not living in Oneida, which was about 4 or 5 miles away, etc., could have their own well-kept, low-rent housing for them. They built a school for them. They made property available so there could be a church for them. So they treated their workforce very, very well. They also hired a large number of local Oneida Indians and also a number of freed African-American slaves who had come up through the Underground Railway and were living in the area. So there were, at any one time, a variety of Indian as well as African-Americans working for them. And they also had lots of outreach. They had what they called Strawberry Fest, where they invite everybody to come and eat the strawberries they were having. They allowed people in for the speakers that they brought in. They also took their orchestra out to the local community and played for them. 4 years after HMS Pinafore, Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore was put on the stage in London, they put it on the stage here in the Mansion House and then took it on the road so that people could enjoy it in the neighborhood. Just some lessons. This is the lessons, or maybe, what would you, I can show you a few more pictures if you want to see pictures, but if you, I'd like to get to what I think are the lessons, but whatever order you want me to do. Let me just run, this is after the breakup because the company becomes very successful as a silverware business, and it does so on the back of many of the ideas of the original community. This was the trap factory. Notice how big that is and how you could produce 400,000 mass-produced traps a year. The man who put this over and made it a successful company was the son of John Humphrey Noyes, P.B. Noyes, and a bunch of other people of his age born into the community that became members of the board of directors in 1895. And the first thing that they did was to say, two of our businesses are probably on the way out, namely traps and silk thread, or at least traps, if not so much silk thread. And we're going to emphasize silverware. We're going to do everything and focus on, and they needed to do three things: have high quality designs, which you can see here, have excellent quality, what they called OCQ, which was their logo. They even had a logo, OCQ, Oneida Community Quality, back in the community days. And they translated that into this, and advertising. And they got Cole Phillips, this guy here, to advertise in all the women's magazines with these wonderful ads of women looking into their silverware box, saying to themselves, my main job is to get married, and my main job is to have this kind of stuff so I can entertain. So it's a kind of irony that you came out of a women's liberated kind of environment of the community to emphasize women back in the home. But it made money hand over fist. And they sold tons of money. This is a Maxwell Parish community ad. They brought all of the manufacturing from Niagara Falls of the silverware because they wanted to bring it right down to where they were. They built a dormitory for several of the unmarried people coming from Niagara Falls. So look, I mean, this is how successful they were. They had enough money to build that building just to house some of the people who were coming from Niagara Falls until they could get their feet settled, and they could start settling these streets in the neighboring community, which was property made available by the company so people could have these small plots and small houses on those plots. But the company also took from the old community and said, we want to have a situation where everybody's needs are taken care of. So early on, they had a retirement program. They had a pension program, but they also had a profit-sharing program. So in expansive years, they shared those profits with everybody. And interestingly, during the Great Depression, when they could have laid off hundreds, indeed more than hundreds of people, they started at the top and said that the salary reductions are going to be between 33 and 35% at the management level, and by the time you get down to the floor of the factory, it's 5%. So they managed to get through the Depression virtually without laying anybody off, because they said we need a low gap between management and labor in terms of times wages from the bottom to the top, and when tough times come, you hit it at the top, lesser at the bottom. They created Sherrill in 1916, even though it was only a town of 3,000. It couldn't be a city. They didn't have the population, but they got the New York State Legislature to say it is a city because the company said, we want you to have your own government. This is not going to be a company town where we determine everything. We're going to have a city where you elect your own officials. And that's what they did here. And we're going to give you property so that you can build your own churches. So early on, property for the Catholic Church, property for the Episcopal, for the Methodist. This is a congregational church who my grandfather, Theodore Skinner, designed. We're going to create schools because a good population, a good society, and a good workforce is an educated workforce. And so Theodore Skinner, my grandfather, designed the high school, the middle school, and the elementary school. And they paid half the cost of the construction, and they paid an endowment, if you will, for the teachers so they could recruit the best teachers. They gave land for a small library because they wanted to have this town, and they had their own form of high street. This is called the Skinner Block, where there were 7 businesses, from a pharmacy to a bank to a grocery store, et cetera, so that people could shop locally. So they said a good society, the idea of the architecture of community, you ought to be able to walk and to communicate with each other, pray with each other, go into this building, which was an old barn but was converted to a basketball court, to bowling alleys and a pool hall, as well as basically a semi-pro level baseball field and tennis courts over here. So they said that what we want you to do is to have a community in which all of your needs, your religious needs, your economic needs, your housing needs, your recreational needs can all be met in an environment with a lot of green space, and the factories are out of the way at either side, edge of the town. Let me just very briefly say what I think are the lessons. The first, and I think most important lesson, is what they got right, is that everybody is multi-talented. Everybody has a lot of different abilities. We're all different in the level of those abilities, but everybody is multi-talented. And if you can tap into those talents, that is what you need. And there's a process through education by which you can begin to tap into those talents. The second thing, and a corollary to this, is that a person's capacity, their talents, are not based upon gender or age. And indeed, because they're not based on gender or age, when you tap into those and you can bring everybody in, it's not only going to be good for the person, but it's going to be good for the society, because you're able to corral all of that ability, all of that talent. Third, they I think got it right that the good society is an abundant society. In other words, if you're just living on the edge, if everybody's living in poverty, or if major segments of your society are living in poverty, that's not a good society. The good society is an abundant society. And the whole question, therefore, is what do you do with that abundance? And they said, as Bible communists, writ corporate leaders, what you do is you try to divide that as evenly as possible, so that the needs of the people who belong to this community are met. And I think that is the third thing that they got right. Fourthly, they got right that education is liberating, that you can self-actualize, if you will, or the process of self-actualization is through education in the largest sense, not just book learning and not just, quote, going to school, but experiencing a variety of things and learning, of opening yourself out, of being led out into other worlds and understanding what you can get from that. And they also recognized as good manufacturers, as Yankee entrepreneurs, that applied knowledge also helps. It helps create that abundance that we just talked about. Fifthly, I think they got it right, and another lesson is that it's not the structure of the family that really matters. It's how that family nurtures its members, and how it protects and nurtures those people. And this could be as unusual as a community of all these mothers and fathers taking care of and being the parents of 100 children. The question is, how do you nurture them? How do you protect them? How do you develop their capacity? Sixthly, I think they got it right that we are social beings. The individual really counts, but we always live in community, and we succeed only to the extent that that community succeeds. And in some sense, ultimately, when push comes to shove, because it's by working together and governing ourselves together and developing our cultural life, etc., as a community, that ultimately the community, in some sense, trumps the individual or has some rights over the individual, or the individual has to step back, at least in some sense, even though one's privacy is critical to maintain. But we live in community, and we succeed or succeed less to the extent that that community thrives. And finally, I think the community demonstrated that there's a kind of marrying of theory and practice. That you can't have theory without practice, but you can't have practice without some degree of theory. And while I think they got it, if you will, desperately wrong, that we can't become perfect, we can't become sinless, I think that what they got right was that the good society, the liberated society, is always a kind of horizon that's just over the horizon. It's a horizon, but you never get there. But I think they also recognize that you have seen enough, you've experienced enough, and you've seen enough of what good can come, so that you know what you ought to be fighting for. And so even if you never get there, even if the horizon is always moving backwards, because you know that people are multi-talented, that gender doesn't matter in that, etc., because community does matter, etc., you have something that you can constantly look forward to and push forward to try to get to someplace better. And that, I think, in my view at least, is not a utopos, a nowhere, but is at least a partially eutopos, a partially good place. I had lots of comments about the beach, but want me to go? Okay. Well, the thing that I wanted to, well, there's several things. First of all, it's going back to the whole idea of utopia. I think utopias inevitably, or the imagining, thinking about utopia, thinking about the good place, always seems to flourish during periods of great social upheaval, social conflict, and several times come immediately to mind around the 16th century in the Protestant Reformation, when the whole religious world is being upended by Martin Luther and the challenge to the Roman Catholic Church, etc., in particular. Or secondly, in the Industrial Revolution, which is upsetting and disturbing of so many different patterns of daily life, of agricultural life, if you will, which is the dominant, what Marx would call mode of production at that point. And in the aftermath of World War II, in the post-World War II period, in the context of the Cold War, the conflict between the Soviet Union on the one hand, et cetera. And the beach, it seems to me, comes out of that kind of that kind of social dislocation, anchored in the Vietnam War and in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And I would argue we're also in a period of pretty high stress and social dislocation at the present time. I'll come back and talk a little bit about that. So I can understand how the beach comes into existence, how this book comes in, and what's happening here, the context. But I think from what I've tried to indicate here, there's a huge number of differences between what you see in the beach, or what's portrayed in the beach, and what is portrayed here. One was that in the beach, and I'll use that as the sort of starting point, the beach was a group of very age-specific people, and a relatively small number of those age-specific people, against 300 plus, and if you include the hirelings, sort of engaged, at least in part in that, 600 people engaged in their community. And in this community, there were always three generations, as opposed to on the beach, where there's just, in effect, one generation interacting with each other. A more important thing is, in the beach, this was an isolated, really secretive place, set off from the world, divorced from the larger society. And the Oneida community, on the other hand, was one that was deeply engaged, said, in fact, we have to be engaged because what we're trying to project is heaven on earth, and the model as to how everybody ought to live if they adopted the same ideas and principles. So whether it's by their publishing activities, their welcoming of visitors, engaging the public in any number of ways, this was a group of people who said, look at us, as opposed to let's stay here on this particular island. The beach was also, it seems to me in reading it, a society based really on scarcity. I mean, it was a pretty scarce society. They were out there fishing every day, and there was a very limited diet, and they were always complaining about the diet because, well, we're going to have mangoes with it at this point or not, et cetera. So there, as opposed to the Oneida community, which argued that you've got to have abundance because abundance is the only thing that makes life good, meets our needs for housing and all the rest of it, for the food, for culture, for leisure time. You've got to have abundance. And so there's an interesting pull between the beach existing on this more primitive, scarce level and the community. And what was particularly important, I think, in that abundance of the community was the cultural life, the musical life, the reading life, the educational life, etc. Fourthly, in the beach, there wasn't, it seemed to me, any sort of coherent social theory that provided answers to how people should govern themselves, how they should create families, what sexual relations should exist. There was no theory, there was practice, there was behavior, but there wasn't any sort of guiding theory or set of principles that were to organize these people, as opposed to these guys who, an orthodox, heretical way, had very particular kinds of ideas, Bible communist and perfectionist ideas as to how people ought to act, how and why sexual relations ought to look like this, how and why children ought to be treated like this, and raised, but sort of kept over here and kept and taken care of by our own people because we're developing our own spiritual lives independently of them, etc. So they had a very coherent ideology. In part, if we go back to the last period of the 1960s, it was really the clash between two highly organized doctrines of communism on the one hand and capitalism on the other hand that were clashing in the Cold War. But these people, I think, didn't have that kind of coherent ideology that was consistent in some ways with that time. Fifthly, I think that the beach community was interested in pleasure. I mean, there was a lot of pot smoking pleasure there, but I don't think there was, again, a kind of conception of what pleasure in its entirety meant. And I think that for the Oneida community, they had pleasure from the spiritual idea of their own perfection, their own union with God, their own salvation given God's grace. But they also had a very developed sense of physical pleasure, the pleasure of sexual relations among multiple parties, the pleasure of education, the pleasure of culture, the pleasure that can come to you in so many different ways. And finally, I think the beach, it was a society that ultimately came to its end in violence. And I think that the Oneida community was manifestly nonviolent. They stayed away from the Civil War, largely not on the principle of nonviolence as Quakers would have it, or as the Shakers were exempted from Civil War duty, but largely because of the fact that they said our job is to create heaven on earth, and we're not going to be just abolitionists, even though they approved of abolition, and we're not going to be women's rights people, although they have approved heartily of Seneca Falls and other kinds of women's liberation, if you will. But they said our job is to focus here and to focus on education of the world to the virtues of perfection in Bible communism. So I think there's some really important differences, and I think that in some sense, in part, it's probably just because I'm a child of the community, but in any event, I think that these lessons that I think that we can learn really do apply to the society today in ways that I think are very much more truncated in the terms of what the beach was saying to the world. So, okay. Well, they were, in one sense, all outsiders. Obviously, some of them weren't. My great-great-grandmother was the sister of John Humphrey Noyes, and a number of those early people who joined the community were family members or people who knew the family in Vermont at that time. But they recruited people from the outside. But they never wanted, and for, I think, wise sociological reasons, to get much beyond 300 to 400 people, just because that becomes a different level of community, very much more difficult to organize. And the Shakers recognized that also by breaking off into separate Shaker communities when they got too big. But the other thing was, you had to agree to three things to be a member. So there was a selection process and actually a probationary process. You had to agree that the second coming was a past event, so that we are living in the kingdom, the unfolding kingdom of God right now. Secondly, you had to believe in complex marriage, so that if you were married legally, you had to renounce that bond and become the husband or the wife of everybody else. They were somewhat loose in terms of whether you had to take part in the sexual life of the community, if you were too old or if there were severe issues that you might have in terms of sexual activity, you could be excused from it. But effectively, you had, if you were a man or a woman, you were going to be married to everybody else. And thirdly, and in my view, perhaps most controversially, you had to believe that John Humphrey Noyes was the literal prophetic embodiment of Christ that goes from Christ to St. Paul to John Humphrey Noyes. You had to believe that he was the latter-day prophet of heaven. And so you had a pretty strict winnowing process. And I think the community, I think, broke apart for many reasons. One, in my view, the most important one was, particularly among the younger generation, conflict over complex marriage. They were born into it rather than voluntarily acceding to it, as their parents had done. And so I think that from the people who came in as visitors, I think they were enormously attracted by the abundance, by the beauty, by the buildings themselves, by the energy of the place, etc. But obviously, this was Victorian times. There were critics out there within other churches, within state organizations that particularly were important at the end of the community and which helped to bring it downfall. As Kate pointed out many years ago to me, I think one of the other reasons was its time had simply passed. In other words, we'd just gone through the Civil War. We had lost nearly 1 million people on both sides of that war. There's a loss of innocence. And so the idea that anybody could create heaven on earth, a perfect, integrated, liberated society, I think no longer sort of fit into the mentality. So people could be very impressed by what they saw, but they didn't like the idea of complex marriage in the first place, and even the possibility of creating something that grandiose. And so I think that we'll stop. Yeah. Well, this was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that leads to the great Jewish diaspora. Well, they just said their reading of the Bible was that, as opposed to the book of Revelations that comes later, their reading of the book was that the second coming would be within a relatively small number of generations of Christ's life itself. And the most dramatic thing that had happened was that conflict leading up to between Romans and the Jews. The most dramatic thing was that destruction of the temple. And so from their view, that had to be the second coming. So that at least at the spiritual level, at least in terms of creating the possibility of Christ's immediate, definite presence in the life of people, that was it, not in the future. And so, this is totally heretical from every Christian, Catholic or Protestant, belief that the second coming is a future event. The 1,000-year reign of Christ comes in the future. They said that this had been set in motion, and it was their job as perfectionists, as Bible communists, living as the early church had, to bring the full flowering of heaven and earth together. To answer your second question, technically the mansion house is located in a little subdivision of the city of Oneida, which is 5 miles away from that. It's a little subdivision called Kenwood. You go across a bridge and you're in Sherrill, and that's where the main part of those manufacturing buildings were located. So the Oneida community owned all of what becomes Sherrill. All of that property basically was owned by them, and they built their factories on the far side of that, on the north side of that. So you see those factories. The Oneida Limited, as it came to be called, Oneida Limited, the silverware company, went Chapter 11, went bankrupt in 2006, and the silverware exists, and the trademark exists, but it's owned by a conglomerate called Everywhere Global at this point that has many different businesses. And it's all manufactured off-site in China, basically. Some of those factories have been adapted to other uses, but the vast majority are not. But the city of Sherrill, with its churches, with its high street, the Skinner Block, with that big building that housed the houses, basketball court, bowling alleys, that's still there. That's a community recreation area. All those playing fields that were laid out by the company are still there. All the houses, the streets are laid out the way they were, named for the most part after members of the Oneida community. There's a noise boulevard, and all the Kinsley Street, the Kinsleys were. So you would see this, what they thought they were creating, a model community, as the corporate leaders of this very successful silverware business. So it has all the churches, all the. You can also visit the mansion house. No, that we've owned it as it was owned by the company until 1988, and then they said, "This is crazy. We're pouring much too much money into this to keep it up." So we started a 901c3, a nonprofit. We took it over in '98. We've been running it for the past 26 years. Yes, yeah. It's a combination of about a third of the mansion house is museum space of one sort or another, either collections management and other kinds of storage space, but also exhibit space. The big hall, the upper sitting room, we have three exhibition spaces, a variety of things. There are 30 apartments there. Kate and I live in one of them. So we get an income stream from that. But Sherrill is, a lovely little town that still has very much the flavor of what it had before. I mean, when it was built. And if you're interested, our daughter has just finished a book on the Oneida community from beginning to end. It's got this lovely subtitle. It's Oneida, from free love utopia to the well-set table, an American story. And yeah. Yes, right. Yes, yes. Only in competition. International was, It was a water source. There were some people, this is a wonderful little story. There were some people by the name of Allen who became converts to perfectionism. They lived here. They lived in Wallingford. And they deeded their property to Christ. So they went to the town hall or whatever it was, and they said, this house and this property we deed to Christ. They did have the sense to make John Humphrey Noyes, I believe, or maybe a combination of people, the managers of this property. So even though it belonged to Christ, there were some real people in real time who were the actual managers of that property. And so that just happened to be in Wallingford. But they got the idea of producing silverware because that whole Connecticut Valley was, with International Silver and whatever, was a silverware producing area. But as we showed in those early the pictures of the spoon, they were very, very crude until they got up to, and so they were not any competitors of International. It's only after 1910 when they brought the entire operation from Niagara Falls to Sherrill, and they brought all those workers with them, and the city of Sherrill went from about 100 to 200 people to over 3,000 people in 4 years. And all those houses got built, the playgrounds, the athletic fields, the schools, the churches developed. Huh. I really don't know, but malaria. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, but that picture of P.B. Noyes, he was J.H.N.'s son, one of 13 children that J.H.N. Had in this complex marriage arrangement. But he had the charisma and the business acumen that his father wasn't, I think, John Humphrey Noyes, I don't think was a hugely successful business person. I think what he did do was to allow other people who had good ideas or who were engineers and chemists and other people to really do important stuff. He didn't stand in the way of that, but I don't think that he was himself as successful a business person as his son, P.B. Noyes. But what was so remarkable about their transformation into OCL, Oneida Community Limited, as a corporation, and going into the silverware business, was that precisely as you've just indicated, the silverware business with Gorham's and all these other manufacturers, up to and including International Silver, were already well established as either sterling manufacturers or plated manufacturers. And so you were going into a business with well-established, well-implanted, existing corporation, and in which there was a huge capital investment. To manufacture silverware, you need all these drop hammers, all these baths in which you have silver bars moving off by electrolysis movement onto the spoons, et cetera, as they get plated. And you've got all of this enormous development of hardware. And the fact that these people said, hey, no problem, we can do that, I think had a great deal to do to the fact that they've been so successful before. In other words, nobody knew how to mass produce traps. You could hand produce those, hand forge, but nobody knew. And they developed their own mechanisms by which they tempered the steel, formed the steel, bent the steel, made the chains that you have on the end that you stake into the ground to keep the animal that you've caught from running away or wrap it around a tree or whatever. They invented all of the machines that allowed them to make the steel of the right temper and the right springiness and the right durability, and to mass produce them, 400 to 500,000 of them a year. And the fact that they'd done that, and the fact that they had sent both men and women, a group of people, out to learn the silk trade, the spinning trade and the dyeing trade, and they came back and said, no problem, and they got that going. I think then they said to themselves, or P.B. Noyes said to himself and that younger generation who surrounded him, not a problem. We can make OCQ quality stuff, in this case silverware, and he had also the vision that you get there by advertising, by successful advertising. And that's where Coles Phillips comes in, and you just transform. You get, it's sort of like women being enticed to smoke, and you see the first ads of women with a cigarette, and they look sort of elegant, and they look sort of fashionable, and they look like they're having a good time, and so over time, you know, you get the idea, okay, it's okay to smoke, and it's okay for women to smoke. And what these guys did was to say, okay, let's focus on sort of upwardly mobile, fashion type women of marriage age thinking, I really want to get married, and I really want to be able to entertain, and what am I going to do? Have something of real high quality, and that will show me off for who I am as housemaker, as wife, as helpmate, etc. And those women staring into their future, into their boxes there of silverware. I mean, that's just brilliant. And they got away from heavy copy. You know, there was a lot of advertising in the early 20th century that's heavy on copy, just lots of words. This is all image. Woman, young, fashionable, marriage-age women looking at their future. And what does the future mean? Good silver. I mean, that's just, and that's PB and another descendant by the name of Doc Dunn, who was the advertising manager. And it just goes on from there. We're thin on the ground on poets, I think. Didn't make silverware. No. Well, thank you.